everyone, my name is Jenna, but you guys can call me Jen, and welcome back to my channel. Welcome to my almost favorites of 2022 video. This little video is because I read so many really good books this year, and a lot of them don't quite fall into my favorites category of the year, so they would probably go untalked about really in these final videos of the year for the most part, and I don't like that. They need to be talked about. They need to be featured a little bit. So I got a bunch of books around me, and we're gonna talk about them. Before we get into my favorites, which should be coming for you guys next week, which is very exciting. My top 10 favorites of 2022. Very exciting. Look out for that. But I went through all the books that I read this year and looked at how many 5 stars versus like 4.5 and 4 stars there were. So all of these books featured in this video, except for the honorary mentions, which are 4 stars, the ones that I'm mentioning are 4.5 star books. So like so close that they're almost favorites, but they're not favorites because of, I don't know, I just haven't been getting that like feeling in my chest like, oh, this is a new favorite book. You know what I mean? It's based solely on vibes, but these are all exceptional books and I consider them some of the best books that I've read. So we're gonna get into it. We're gonna get into this incredible list. Number one that we're gonna talk about is Seven Devils and its sequel, Seven Mercies, by Elizabeth May and Laura Lam. This is a sci-fi duology that just was exceptional. I originally had picked up Seven Devils from the library earlier this year, and I liked it so much that I wanted a physical copy of it, so that's why I bought it and I have it in my hands. And I will be doing so with Seven Mercies as well to complete the duology once I find it at a reasonable price. This was just so good. So this follows a found family of queer people with different kinds of disabilities. We have Chloe and Eris, who are our main 2 characters in this. They are enemies, if you will, at the beginning of this because of their past and their history together, because Eris is someone who is hiding her identity, her true identity, and for many, many different reasons. And so in this, they are part of a like resistance kind of force, if you will, and they have to do a heist. They have to do kind of like a heisty type of job situation together, and they are put together, which Chloe is not happy about. Neither is Eris really. That kind of starts this off, and during this mission, they end up meeting 3 other characters who become part of their team, and they also, eventually, by the end of it, there are 7 of them, which is called the Seven Devils, and it's just wonderful. And this one was kind of like more fun space antics with heist vibes. The sequel, on the other hand, was gut-wrenching and, oh boy, a lot. This whole world is very, very politically bent and interesting. It's very space opera. It's very, it was so good, and I absolutely loved it. And I think that it was expertly well done with all of the different perspectives in this. And I believe in the first book, we get a lot of memory flashbacks. So we get a lot of like really well thought out backstory, and it all means something, and it is all going to a certain end game. It was just fantastic. So that's why these 2 books are on here, because they were both 4.5 stars. The next one is kind of a little bit sad in a way, a little bit of bittersweet, because its sequel, its first one, was my favorite book of the year last year, but this one's only making it onto an almost favorite, and that's A Prayer for the Crown Child by Becky Chambers, because its first one is A Psalm for the Wild Bull, which is one of the best books I've ever read in my life. So Prayer is very good. It is an exceptionally well-written novel, and it did give me all of the feelings that I wanted it to. It's just not quite at the level of caliber that Psalm is. But this is the second in the Monk and Robot novella kind of series that Becky Chambers is currently doing. Monk and Robot follows Dex and Mosscap, who are, Dex is a tea monk who is on essentially a quest to discover joy in their life again, and Mosscap is a robot. They have a lot of really deep conversations, and that's what these 2 books are. I would say that this one specifically feels like a late summer day on the beach with your friends as the sun's setting, and Psalm feels like an autumnal day where you're wrapped in a blanket and drinking a cup of tea at the perfect temperature. So that's what this is. And I love it, but it's not quite at the caliber that Psalm was, so it's an almost favorite. The next 2 here are interesting for sure, because the first book is one of my favorite books of all time now. When I originally read it, I think it was only a 4 star or 4.5 star, but when I reread it this year, I bumped it to a 5. And I actually reread both the first one and the second one in preparation for the third one, and now the second and third one are out, or on this almost favorites list, because I totally forgot, but I read the second book earlier this year for the first time. And that is Harrow and Nona the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. So I can't include Gideon on this list because I read Gideon for the first time last year, and it is now officially one of my favorite books of all time because I've reread it and it's a 5-star book for me. It's just absolutely amazing. But these two books were read for the first time this year. Harrow has been read twice over because I reread it in preparation for Nona when it came out later this year. I love these books. Don't get me wrong, but they are not 5 stars. These two are not 5 stars for me. They're very close, which is why they're on an almost favorites list, and this is one of my favorite series of all time. And you know what? There's something about these Locked Tomb books that just does something for me. I don't know what it is, but yes. So we have Harrow, which is book 2, and Nona, which is book 3. And I'm so excited for book 4. Y'all have no idea. But both of these follow the events after Gideon, and in different ways. They're very confusing. The narration style is wild. It's filled with memes and confusion. I will say Nona was a lot easier to understand than either Harrow or Gideon, and Harrow is probably the most confusing of all of them because Harrow, our narrator, Harrow Hark, is going through a mental break throughout this book, and you're reading that, and it's wild. But Nona was much easier to follow throughout because it was a much easier narrative to follow by a landslide. But I loved these books. I adored these books, and that is why they're on this almost favorites list. But yeah, this whole series is one of my favorite series of all time, and I cannot wait to see how it ends with Alecto the Ninth, which is going to come out at some point. I'm hoping it's coming out next year, but I truly cannot describe to you what these books are about. So the Locked Tomb series, if you will, starts with Gideon the Ninth, which is currently behind me on my shelf right there. And it follows Gideon Nav, who is tasked to be a cavalier to Harrow Hark Nona Jesmus as they go to a different planet to essentially partake in some sort of trial, some sort of ceremony thing. They're not entirely sure, to become a lictor, which is this really high position in the universe of theirs that is essentially like the right hand of God, of the God in this world. And so Gideon is a murder mystery style, and then there were nun vibe necromancers and cavaliers trying to figure out what's going on in space thing. This is the after effect of that and Harrow Hark's mental break from that. And then this is the introduction to a brand new character, Nona, as she is living with some characters that we meet in Harrow and the after effects of what happened in Harrow and what's going to happen next. That's the easiest way I can explain this. There's necromancy, it's set in space, weird shit's happening. It's the best. It's truly the best. We got another sequel. There's a lot of sequels on this list, my friends. There's a lot of sequels. But this one is Hunger of the Gods by John Gwynne. This is the sequel to Shadow of the Gods, which is up here, which is the first of the Bloodsworn trilogy. So this was the long-awaited sequel for me because I was waiting for this with bated breath. And this was masterful. This was so good, but not a favorite of mine. But again, this trilogy is becoming a favorite trilogy of mine too, so like, who knows? It's just vibes at this point. This is a 4.5 star, that's why it's on this list. I loved this. I screamed at the end. This continues after the events of Shadow of the Gods, follows the same characters, follows Orca, who is my favorite character ever besides Gideon the Ninth. Yeah, that's all I can really say about this because it's epic, it's Skyrim vibes, but more brutal. It's just exceptional. It's exceptional, this whole series. And it, like, what I loved about this sequel, because I don't know, if you guys have been around on my channel for a long time, you know that I have trouble with sequels. So a lot of times book 2s have a lot of book 2 syndrome-y type stuff, like they feel like just a bridge book between book 1 and 2. But this book takes what we learn in book 1 and amps it up to 10 or 100, if you will, and turns a lot of the things that we've learned as beliefs in book 1, shows us exactly how wrong we were and how wrong the characters were. And it just is so epic. And I cannot wait for book 3. It's gonna tear me apart, truly gonna tear me apart, but it's so good. If you're looking for like a good epic fantasy series to get into, John Gwynne is your guy. Truly. Next up, we actually have one that I want to reread to see if it's actually a 5-star or a favorite book. But again, it's the start to a series that I think is going to be one of my favorite series. There's 2 of them on this list that are like that are like starts to a series that are probably going to be favorite series of all time for me. But that is The Stardust Thief by Chelsea Abdullah. I read this almost in one day, I think, and I was enraptured from page 1. This was exceptional. I loved this book and I really want to reread it. It's like one of those books I want to be back in this world. So this follows Luli, who is the Midnight Merchant, and this Midnight Merchant who is essentially a criminal who sells stuff, who sells artifacts, if you will, and her Djinn bodyguard. And her Djinn bodyguard is my favorite character ever. I love him. And it follows a couple other characters. Like, it's a cast of characters that go on this quest, if you will, to find an artifact. This feels like We Hunt the Flame and An Ember in the Ashes and City of Brass. Like, it feels along the lines of those fantasy books, but better, because I liked this one so much more than those. I loved An Ember in the Ashes. It's one of my favorite series of all time, but this feels like a step up of that. This is also adult fantasy. So I cannot wait for the second and the next one. I don't know how many there's going to be. It's a trilogy, the Sand Sea trilogy. So there's going to be 2 more coming out in this series at some point. I am just amped for it. It was so good. Writing incredible. Characters amazing. Next one is a horror fantasy, actually, and that is The Helm of Midnight by Marina Lostetter. So this is the first, again, of a series that almost could stand on its own, in my opinion. This has some of the coolest magic systems and like object systems that I've ever come across in books in my entire life. I loved the aspect of masks in this and imbuing masks with the memory and the talents of whoever decides to do a mask. They're like, it's a play on death masks in this world, and there's also these like demon creatures, and it's just like, from word go, it sets the horror tone and it follows through the whole time. You're following our main character who is hunting down this person who steals the mask of a serial killer and thus goes about serial killing people. You're also following a woman in this who has ties to the serial killer, and you're also following the serial killer themselves from the past. So the actual like the guy that the mask was made out of, essentially. And it was so entrancing, and I liked it so much more than I thought I was going to. I had a great time reading this. The atmosphere was so good, and I loved the magic system in this. I don't even know if I can call it a magic system because it's not like it's actively being used, but the aspect of masks, loved it. And like the gem imbuing in here as well was really cool, and I really liked our main character. So again, I'm excited to see where the sequel goes with this, because as I said, it could almost stand alone. So I'm intrigued to see where this story goes from here, because this was already wild. So we'll see. Next is, as I mentioned with The Stardust Thief, the start of a series that I think could be one of my favorite series of all time, and that is Scorpica by G.R. McAllister. This is a women-centered fantasy where in this queendom, they are going through a drought of girls, which means that there are no girls being born for like a decade stretch. And it's a problem that isn't really realized to be a problem until a few years in, because of course you don't realize that no girls are being born until you look around and all the babies that are just boys. And in a lot of these kingdoms, in one specific kingdom as well, Scorpica, they ship the boys away to other cities because there's like, it's a queendom in here, it's a matriarchy, it's women-led. This was fabulous. I think the first half I did struggle a little bit with, if I remember correctly, but what I loved about this is that it's an epic fantasy, so that it covers many, many years. And I read this around the time where I was reading the final 2 books in the Jade City series. And what I didn't like about this series, except for the first one was really good, was that it felt really episodic in the way that it was jumping years. This did not feel that way at all, even though it was jumping years as well. We got a few main storylines in this that covered and spanned years. This like 10-year drought situation of The Drought of Girls, and yet it didn't feel episodic at all. Every time we changed perspectives, I was completely entranced with that perspective we were given and so into the story. And I just like, we would switch and then I'd be like, okay, I'm into this one. And then we'd switch again and I'd be like, oh, we're back with this one. It was so good. And I don't see enough people talking about this book. This is an exceptional fantasy book and everybody needs to read it. The next one I don't actually own. It's a trilogy that I read through my library originally and through Scribd. It's by C.L. Polk, who is becoming one of my favorite authors, who wrote The Midnight Bargain, which I cannot see. Oh, it's right here. C.L. Polk, we love to see it. And which is, you know, a fantastic read, but their original trilogy, the Witchmark trilogy, I read earlier this year, which is a fantasy romance set in the Edwardian period. And this trilogy blew me away. It blew me away. My favorite book of the trilogy was the first one, Witchmark, but I loved all three books. So this trilogy follows this cast of people, but each book follows a different person in it and follows a different relationship in it. So the first book is a queer male-male romance with our main character, and then the second book follows his sister, and then the third book follows a nurse that works with the guy. And it's this, like, their romance at the same time as like the actual events are happening. Afterwards, you're sitting there and you're like, this happens in like 3 weeks. Like, it's a very condensed timeline that you're living in these books with these people and the events that are happening, but it's so good. I loved it. And the Edwardian time, the Edwardian like setting was exceptional. It was like London with a touch of magic. It was perfect. It was truly perfect. And I really, really liked them so much. They're definitely almost favorites of the year. Yeah, that's all I can really say about those. Those are fantastic books. I think that's almost all that I have to talk about today. These last ones on this list are definitely almost favorites of 2022. Then I have 3 honorary mentions that I'm going to talk about that are 4 stars, but these both are the first and the second of a series again that is becoming one of my favorite series of all time. This is a sci-fi series called The Last Watch. I think it's called The Divide. Oh, I don't know if it has a name. I don't know if this series has a name. Oh yeah, A Novel of the Divide. Yes, that is the series name. I don't know how many there are going to be in this series, but I love them so much. This is the level of space opera that I want to read. I adored these books. Like, The Last Watch swept me away. It was a level of humanity that I got in my Becky Chambers reads up here in her space operas, but paired with the technological action-packed space opera that I expected to get in a lot of other things. The way that it was offered was so nice because you're getting this epic, technologically fueled, huge, action-packed space opera from the point of view of 2 people, and you get their connections and you connect to them and you're living in them, in their little world, and you are connected into the story. And I think that's what you really need in a lot of these space operas that follow like a really large cast of characters, because you just can't really like sink your teeth into the humanity of the story as well, which is something that Becky Chambers is a master in, the humanity of these stories. These were just so good, and the 2 main characters are my favorite. I love them so much. I love their relationship. It's entirely platonic, and there's not a hint of romance there, which is so nice for once to have a man and a woman be like just friends essentially, or co-workers at the beginning of this, because she's his like superior officer. But their relationship together in these books is just so precious because it grows into something that is, they desperately need each other and they desperately need to be there for each other. And I love it so much. It's my favorite friendship I've read, for sure, and I love them so much. But yes, this is The Last Watch, which essentially follows these, I like to pitch this as like the trope in this essentially is like, it's the last team that humanity wants to save the universe, but it's what humanity has kind of a thing, or what the universe has. So it follows Adequin Rake and Cav, who are, Adequin Rake is like the superior officer, the runner of the ship situation, and Cav is a disgraced, like excommunicated kind of son of this general guy who essentially runs a big part of the universe, part of, you know, life. And they're stuck on this ship of castaways, people like the dredges of humanity, people that don't want, like people who humanity does not want around anymore. They're put on this ship at the edge of the universe to watch what is called the Divide. which is the edge of the universe. And in this book, they realize that the divide is starting to come closer to them. And as it's coming closer, there are interesting effects, of course, because it's like time is very different in this world, and where you are, time runs differently. So like to them, what is 4 years could be like 4 months for other people on spaceships. So like time is a little wonky, and then there are time blips in this where they can walk into a room and already see themselves in there, and it's like a blip that's already happened. It's so interesting. In this, the divide is coming closer, so they have to save humanity because literally nobody else can get there in time. And then this is the after effects of that. And then the next one's gonna be after effects of this. Wild. I love those books. I love those books so much. So those are my almost favorites. Now we're going to talk about some of the 4 stars that I still wanted to put on this list that are almost favorites as well. Like almost favorites, if you will, but I wanted to talk about them anyways. And this is where we're going to get some of the only non-fantasy genre stuff. I have 2 here that aren't fantasy. So the first one here though is Truthwitch by Susan Dennard, which was such a genuine, lovely surprise for me this year. I read this book as part of My Friends Picked My TBR. It was the internet edition that I did. One of my friends picked it for me to read. I believe it was Hannah from the author H.M. Long. I adored this. So much so that I have like the next 2 on my shelves above me. And it was just such a pleasant surprise how much I adored this one. This gave me the feelings of like Realm Breaker that I read last year. It just worked for me. So this follows Safi and Iseult. Safi is a truth witch, which is, you know, the title, someone who can seek out lies and stuff like that. And it follows Iseult, who is a thread witch who can like see connections in people. And it's really interesting that like what goes on in this politically charged narrative. And you're also following a prince as well, who is a wind witch. And like the tension between him and Safi is off the charts. It's very good. Loved this, and I cannot wait to continue with the series. And all right, the 2 that aren't fantasy are Delilah Green Doesn't Care by Ashley Herring Blake and Finlay Donovan Knocks Him Dead by Elle Cosimano. So this one is a queer romance between a single mother and a like photographer from New York, Delilah Green, who gets hired by her stepmom to be the photographer at her stepsister's wedding. And so she comes back into town, and there's a lot of grievances, there's a lot of tension between this family, and she ends up meeting one of Astrid, her sister's friends, who is Claire Sutherland, who is this curvaceous bisexual woman who just, you know, sweeps her off her feet, and their romance is one of my favorites. This was exceptional. I loved this. And then Finlay Donovan Knocks Him Dead is the second of the Finlay Donovan series. This crime, rom-com, literary comedy series, I don't even know what to classify this as, is one of my favorites because it's just the perfect amount of absurd and like unbelievable, but it's just so fun. And I want this to be a TV show so bad because it would just be the perfect amount of camp and bad TV that I would just love to consume at top speed. I love this. So Finlay Donovan is a single mom and an author who's struggling to write her next book and make ends meet. At the beginning of the previous book, she is talking to her agent about one of her books in a coffee shop when she's overheard by someone nearby, and Finlay herself is a crime writer. When she leaves, she ends up getting approached by a woman who was sitting nearby in the cafe who misunderstood Finlay's occupation and essentially hires Finlay to be a hitman and kill her husband for 50 grand. Now, Finlay is not a killer, but that 50 grand is very, very intriguing, and she cannot get it off her mind. And so in an attempt to not get involved, she ends up getting involved, and her nanny, who is one of my favorites of all time, Vero, they get involved, and it's antics like crazy, and there's the mob, and it's so good. And this is the second, and I'm so excited for the third. I don't know how many there are going to be in this series, but it's going to be amazing. book after book after book, because it's just the perfect amount of absurd that I love, and it was just such a fun time reading the sequel this year. Anyway, my friends, that is all from me. Those are my almost favorites and almost favorites of 2022. Please let me know down below some of your almost favorites, because I would love to know what you loved this year, even if it didn't quite make it onto your favorites list, because there are so many fantastic books out there that we need to talk about still. We need to talk about these books because they are still so good and so worth the read, even if they're not quite favorites. They're so close though. Anyways, my friends, I will catch you in another video very soon. Stay kind and keep on reading.